On the night of March 9, 1945, Tokyo appeared peaceful under a moonless sky. Families slept in their wooden homes, certain that the worst of the conflict was behind them. They had survived 2 years of air operations, adapted to rationing, learned to recognize warning sirens. Most believed they understood what danger looked like from the sky. They were catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What those sleeping civilians could not imagine was that within hours, they would experience something far more terrifying than anything yet conceived in warfare. Something so devastating that even the revolutionary weapons deployed months later at Hiroshima and Nagasaki would seem to survivors almost merciful by comparison. Kazuko Sadamori was 23 years old, working as a telephone operator in the Asakusa district. She lived with her mother, father, and 2 younger brothers in a modest home built entirely of wood and paper, like 97% of Tokyo's residential structures. On the evening of March 8th, she wrote in her diary about the pleasant spring weather approaching, about hopes that the conflict would end soon, about her youngest brother's upcoming birthday. She mentioned the air raid sirens that had become so routine that most families no longer rushed to shelters. The bombers had been targeting industrial facilities, dropping explosive ordnance that could be survived if you weren't directly underneath. The pattern was known, predictable, manageable. At 1:48 in the morning on March 10th, Kazuko woke to the familiar sound of air raid sirens. She started to roll over and return to sleep when her father appeared at her door, his face strangely pale in the lamplight. Something was different this time. He had been listening to neighborhood watch reports. The incoming force was enormous, 334 aircraft, all Boeing B-29s, and they were flying unusually low, just 5,000 feet instead of the typical 25,000. This meant they were coming with different intentions. The bombers arrived in waves, each aircraft carrying approximately 6 tons of a new type of munition that most Tokyo residents had never encountered. These weren't the explosive ordnance that destroyed individual buildings. These were incendiary clusters, each one designed to break apart at altitude and scatter dozens of smaller fire-starting devices across a wide area. The Americans called them M69 incendiary clusters. Each cluster contained 47 individual bomblets, filled with a substance called napalm, a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acids mixed with gasoline that created a gel which stuck to surfaces and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Warrant Officer Takeshi Maeda was stationed at an observation post in eastern Tokyo. He had served for 3 years and considered himself hardened to the realities of conflict. He had witnessed explosive strikes, seen buildings collapse, helped extract survivors from rubble. When the first incendiaries began falling, he assumed this would be manageable, just another air operation requiring coordinated firefighting response. His training had covered fire suppression techniques. The city had organized neighborhood brigades with buckets, hand pumps, and designated water sources. Within 12 minutes of the first incendiaries landing, Maeda realized that everything he knew about fire was inadequate for what was happening. The incendiary clusters didn't just start fires, they created a phenomenon that would later be termed a firestorm. The bomblets fell in a precise pattern designed by American targeting specialists to form a wall of flame around a 7-square-mile area containing the highest concentration of wooden structures in Tokyo. The fires didn't spread randomly, they created their own weather system. As thousands of individual fires merged, they began consuming oxygen at such a tremendous rate that air was pulled inward from all directions toward the center of the burning zone. This created winds exceeding 70 miles per hour, hurricane-force gusts that turned the firestorm into a self-sustaining tornado of flame. The temperature at ground level reached somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass, hot enough to cause the water in fire cisterns to boil away, hot enough to ignite wood simply from radiant heat without flames ever touching it. Kazuko and her family tried to follow the standard procedure: wet blankets, face coverings, orderly evacuation to the nearest designated shelter. They left their home at approximately 2:15 in the morning, joining their neighbors in the narrow street. Everyone moved calmly at first. This was a drill they had practiced. But within 3 blocks, Kazuko realized they were not heading towards safety. They were heading into an inferno that surrounded them on 3 sides. The firestorm's behavior defied logical expectation. Buildings would suddenly burst into flames, despite being a full block away from any visible fire. The superheated air ignited paper doors, wooden beams, clothing on people's bodies. Kazuko watched a woman ahead of her suddenly fall, her hair smoking, and realized the woman hadn't been touched by flames, just by air so hot it could no longer sustain life. The temperature was cooking people alive through radiant heat alone. Shigeru Nakamura was 9 years old that night. His family lived in the Fukagawa district, directly in the path of the firestorm. Decades later, when interviewed by historians, Nakamura would describe what he saw with a precision that never faded despite 7 decades passing. He remembered his father trying to lead the family toward the Sumida River, believing that water would provide refuge. They never made it. The streets became clogged with thousands of people, all having the same idea simultaneously. The canals and rivers that crisscrossed Tokyo should have provided safety. Instead, they became death traps. Thousands of people jumped into the water to escape the heat, but the firestorm was so intense that the water temperature in some canals rose to near boiling. Nakamura watched people in the water suddenly stop moving, poached alive like eggs in a pot. Those who stayed on bridges saw the wooden structures ignite beneath their feet. Those who remained on land faced temperatures that made breathing fatal. The phenomenon occurring over Tokyo that night had only happened once before in recorded history, during the Hamburg firebombing in Germany 18 months earlier. But Tokyo's wooden construction made it far more vulnerable. The city had essentially been transformed into the world's largest kindling pile, arranged perfectly for maximum combustion. Flight engineer Robert Caron was aboard one of the 334 aircraft participating in the operation. His bomber was part of the second wave, arriving about an hour after the initial incendiaries were dropped. From 20,000 feet, he could see the entire metropolis transforming into a sea of flame. The smoke column rose so high that bombers had to climb above 30,000 feet to avoid the turbulence. The smell of burning wood and other materials penetrated even into the sealed aircraft at altitude, a sweet, acrid scent that Caron would never forget. In his mission log, he noted that the glow from the fires was visible for more than 150 miles as they flew back toward base. What made this weapon psychologically devastating wasn't just its lethality, but its cruelty of time. Explosive ordnance brought instant outcomes, decisive conclusions. The incendiary attack on Tokyo lasted nearly 3 hours. For survivors like Kazuko and young Nakamura, those 3 hours felt like days. They experienced every stage of the inferno, the initial confusion, the dawning realization of the scale, the desperate search for escape routes, the accumulating exhaustion as option after option closed off, the final moments of pure survival instinct. Kazuko became separated from her family approximately 40 minutes into their attempted escape. The crowd was moving like a river current, individual control impossible. She was swept along narrow streets lined with burning buildings, pushed by people behind her who were themselves being pushed by the expanding fire zone. She tried to call out for her mother, but the roar of the flames was so loud that even screaming was inaudible beyond a few feet. The firestorm created its own thunder, a continuous rolling boom as superheated air expanded and exploded. She found herself in a small park, where hundreds of people had gathered, believing the open space would protect them. It didn't. The radiant heat from surrounding fires turned the park into an oven. People began collapsing from heat exhaustion, even though flames weren't directly touching them. Kazuko watched a mother trying to shield 3 small children under her body, all of them prostrate on the ground, seeking cooler air near the earth. Within minutes, none of them were moving. The children had suffocated from oxygen depletion before the flames ever reached them. Nakamura and his family made different choices. His father realized early that crowds meant death and pulled them down a side alley that seemed to lead away from the thickest fires. They found an abandoned warehouse with concrete walls, a rare structure in this district. They broke through a window and sheltered inside, packing wet cloth under the doors and around the windows. His father organized shifts. Some family members would work continuously to wet down the interior walls and door, while others would rest. They spent 4 hours in that building, listening to the world outside transform into an acoustic nightmare of screaming, crashing buildings, and the endless roar of flame. The psychological impact of incendiary weapons lay in their relentlessness. Explosive ordnance created discrete events, a blast, destruction, conclusion. Fire was continuous, growing, surrounding, pursuing. It created the sensation of being hunted by an intelligent predator. Survivors repeatedly described the feeling that the fire was chasing them, that it knew where they were hiding, that it was trying to find them. This anthropomorphization of the flame wasn't poetic language. It was how human brains attempted to process an experience that violated all normal patterns of threat. By dawn on March 10th, the firestorm had burned itself out, consuming everything flammable within its 17-square-mile impact zone. The death count would never be precisely known. Conservative estimates placed it at 80,000 people. Other calculations suggested closer to 100,000. More people were lost in that single night than would later perish at Hiroshima or Nagasaki individually. But the number of fatalities, while historically significant, was less important psychologically than how those people perished. Kazuko survived by eventually finding her way to a concrete bridge foundation and submerging herself in the river up to her neck, breathing through a wet cloth while embers fell like rain around her. She lost consciousness at some point from exhaustion and hypothermia and woke at sunrise lying on the riverbank, pulled from the water by a rescue worker. She had no memory of being extracted. Her mother and younger brothers had survived by taking shelter in a school building's concrete stairwell. Her father and oldest brother were never found. The American military conducted 56 more major incendiary operations against Japanese cities over the following 5 months. Osaka was targeted on March 13th, losing 136,000 buildings. Nagoya followed on March 19th. Kobe burned on March 16th. Yokohama on May 29th. By July of 1945, 67 Japanese cities had experienced systematic firebombing. The total number of civilians who perished from incendiary attacks exceeded 400,000, with millions more displaced and injured. What puzzled American military analysts was the civilian population's reaction to these weapons compared to their later response to atomic ordnance. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck in August 1945, international observers expected mass panic, psychological collapse, immediate surrender. Instead, the Japanese government's response was initially bureaucratic and measured. Hiroshima's destruction on August 6th prompted discussion but not immediate capitulation. Even after Nagasaki on August 9th, there were military factions advocating continued resistance. Major Harold Williamson was part of the intelligence team analyzing Japanese civilian morale. In reports filed between March and August 1945, he documented an unexpected pattern. Civilian resistance to continued conflict was highest in cities that had experienced incendiary attack and relatively lower in cities that had experienced explosive bombing or no attack at all. Refugees fleeing firebombed cities spread accounts that created widespread dread of incendiary weapons specifically. But after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the emotional tenor of civilian accounts was different, characterized more by shock and numbness than by the visceral terror associated with fire. Williamson interviewed dozens of survivors after the conflict ended. The pattern in their accounts was consistent and surprising. Those who had experienced firebombing described it in terms of personal agency destroyed. They talked about the impossible decisions, which family member to follow, which direction to run, whether to seek water or open ground, whether to hide or flee. Every choice had proven wrong for someone. The fire had created extended periods of decision-making under maximum stress, hours of accumulating trauma as each attempted solution failed. In contrast, survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki described their experience almost as if it had happened to someone else. There was a flash, then unconsciousness or disorientation, then suddenly finding themselves in a devastated landscape. The time frame was compressed. For many, there were no decisions to make. The event was over before conscious response was possible. This created a different psychological aftermath, profound dislocation and grief, but less of the specific terror associated with prolonged pursuit by flame. Yoshiko Hashimoto survived both the Tokyo firebombing and, 5 months later, happened to be visiting relatives on the outskirts of Nagasaki when the atomic weapon was deployed there. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, she provided a unique comparative perspective. The atomic strike was devastating but comprehensible, she explained. It was like a natural disaster, an earthquake or typhoon, something that happened and then was over. The mind could encompass it, even though the scale was unprecedented. The firebombing, by contrast, had felt like deliberate torture, an extending of suffering across hours, a methodical destruction that gave just enough time to understand what was happening, but not enough capability to prevent it. This psychological distinction had practical consequences for military planners. The stated intention of strategic bombing campaigns was to break civilian morale and force governmental surrender. By this measure, incendiary weapons were more effective than atomic ones. Cities that experienced firebombing showed measurably decreased industrial output, higher rates of evacuation, greater resistance to governmental calls for continued sacrifice. The atomic weapons, while massively destructive, struck just 2 cities and created a psychological response that was more shock than terror. Dr. Fumiko Watanabe was a psychiatrist who began studying trauma in bombing survivors in 1946. Her research, conducted over 4 decades, identified distinct pattern differences between survivors of different weapon types. Those who had experienced incendiary attack showed higher rates of persistent fear responses, startle reactions, and fire-specific phobias. They avoided confined spaces, showed extreme anxiety around smoke or heat, had recurring dreams of being trapped. Their trauma was anchored to specific sensory experiences: the sound of crackling flames, the smell of smoke, the sensation of heat on skin. Atomic weapon survivors showed different patterns. Their trauma often manifested as survivor guilt, existential despair, and social withdrawal. They struggled with questions of meaning and purpose. Why had they survived when thousands around them had not? What did it mean that their city had been chosen for this unprecedented weapon? Their dreams were less about the event itself and more about its aftermath. Wandering through silent ruins, searching for family who would never be found, witnessing injuries they couldn't help. The incendiary raids also created a unique form of anticipatory dread. After Tokyo burned in March, residents of other cities knew exactly what was coming for them. They had heard the accounts, seen the refugees, understood the sequence of events. This advanced knowledge created weeks or months of mounting anxiety, fundamentally different from the sudden shock of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, where no one knew such weapons existed until the moment of detonation. Nakamura, the 9-year-old who survived with his family in the concrete warehouse, later described this anticipatory terror. His family evacuated to a rural village after the Tokyo raid, joining thousands of other refugees. But the village wasn't safe, it was simply not yet targeted. Every clear night brought anxiety. Every distant sound of engines created panic. Sleep became difficult. His mother developed a ritual of checking the sky every few minutes, as if vigilance alone could prevent attack. This constant state of threat awareness wore down civilians in ways that even massive destruction from atomic weapons did not, because fire was something they had all experienced in small scale and could therefore imagine in large scale. The technical specifications of the 2 weapon types partly explained the psychological difference. An atomic weapon released its energy in a fraction of a second, producing immediate effects: blast pressure, thermal radiation, initial nuclear radiation. Those within the immediate radius either perished instantly or received injuries, whose full effects would manifest over hours or days. But the acute event was over in moments. An incendiary attack released its energy over hours as thousands of tons of flammable material burned. The M69 clusters were specifically designed to start fires that would spread from building to building, creating a self-sustaining combustion event that continued long after the bombers departed. The strategic intention was to overwhelm firefighting capabilities, ensuring that the destruction would continue without any additional input from attackers. This meant victims had prolonged engagement with the threat, hours of active survival struggle, rather than a single moment of overwhelming force. Fire Marshal Kenji Yoshida was responsible for firefighting coordination in Osaka. during the March 13th incendiary raid on that city. His detailed report, filed with occupation authorities after the conflict ended, provided insight into why incendiary weapons were so psychologically devastating for both victims and those trying to help them. Yoshida described arriving at a residential district 30 minutes after the incendiaries began falling. He had 16 firefighting teams with hand pumps and bucket brigades. Within an hour, all 16 teams had retreated, their equipment abandoned, because the fire's scale made intervention meaningless. Yoshida wrote that the psychological impact of futility was crushing. In a normal fire, even a large one, firefighters could see their efforts producing results. Flames dampened, progression slowed, civilians evacuated. In the firestorm, every action was negated. Water vaporized before it reached flames. Streets that were clear became impassable in minutes. Buildings that seemed safe ignited spontaneously from radiant heat. The fire had crossed a threshold into becoming a force of nature like a hurricane or tsunami, something that could only be endured, not fought. For civilians watching professional firefighters retreat in defeat, the message was clear. There was no institution, no authority, no organized response that could protect them. This sense of total systemic failure amplified individual terror. When atomic weapons struck, there was no expectation that anyone could have prevented it. The weapon was unprecedented, mysterious, almost supernatural in its effects. There was no blame to assign to local authorities or defensive systems because no one had known such weapons existed. But incendiary raids struck repeatedly, giving civilians time to ask why defenses were inadequate, why evacuation wasn't better organized, why firefighting proved so futile. The failure was comprehensible, and therefore someone's fault, creating layers of anger and betrayal alongside fear. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka was a civil defense coordinator in Yokohama. After his city experienced its major incendiary raid on May 29th, killing approximately 7,000 civilians and destroying 42% of the urban area, Tanaka filed a resignation letter that was discovered in archives decades later. In it, he described the psychological burden of having designed evacuation plans that proved completely inadequate. He had studied previous raids, created what he believed were optimal routes to safety, organized practice drills. When the actual attack came, every evacuation route became a death trap, clogged with panicked crowds moving away from fire, only to find more fire ahead. Tanaka's letter expressed a kind of moral injury, the trauma of having been responsible for civilian safety and failing, despite genuine preparation and effort. This moral injury extended beyond officials to ordinary citizens who had accepted neighborhood leadership roles. Japan's civil defense system organized civilians into mutual assistance groups. Each neighborhood had designated wardens, fire coordinators, evacuation leaders. During incendiary raids, many of these volunteers found their authority meaningless. They couldn't answer people's questions about where safety could be found because they didn't know. They couldn't provide reassurance because their own plans had failed. Some abandoned their posts, leading to lifetime guilt. Others stayed and perished trying to help, leaving survivors with complicated grief. Kazuko never returned to her telephone operator position. The central exchange where she had worked was completely destroyed. Even if it had been rebuilt, she told interviewers decades later, she couldn't have gone back. The work involved coordinating emergency communications, helping connect people during crises. On the night of March 10th, the telephone system had been overwhelmed within minutes, people trying to call family, to request help. To coordinate evacuation heard only busy signals or deadlines. Kazuko felt complicit in that failure, though rationally she understood no telephone system could have functioned during such chaos. The incendiary raids created thousands of these small, personal narratives of systemic collapse and individual powerlessness. By comparison, atomic weapons created narratives of shared victimhood. Everyone in Hiroshima who survived felt they had escaped death by chance. Being in a reinforced building, being shielded by a hill, being just outside the radius of immediate lethality. There was little room for self-blame or feelings of having made wrong choices because there had been no time for choices. The trauma was collective and somewhat equalizing. In firebombed cities, survivors carried individual burden. Each person's story included decisions made, paths chosen, family members last seen heading in different directions. The opportunity for choice created the opportunity for regret. Nakamura's father never recovered from the decision to shelter in the concrete warehouse. The strategy had saved their immediate family, but Nakamura's uncle and his children had not followed them into the building, believing instead that reaching the river offered better protection. They were never found. For the rest of his life, Nakamura's father was haunted by the moment he could have insisted his brother follow them, versus respecting his brother's judgment about his own family's safety. This kind of specific decision point trauma was characteristic of firebombing survivors and much less common among atomic weapon survivors. Medical treatment patterns also revealed psychological differences. Hospitals treating firebombing survivors dealt primarily with burns of varying degrees, smoke inhalation, fractures from falling debris, exhaustion, and malnutrition. These injuries were comprehensible to medical staff and to patients. Treatment followed established protocols. Recovery timelines could be estimated. Survivors could understand their prognosis and plan accordingly. Atomic weapon survivors presented with radiation sickness, an array of symptoms that neither patients nor doctors initially understood. Hair falling out, immune system collapse, strange bleeding, cellular damage that manifested weeks after exposure. The mysterious nature of these ailments created different anxieties. Firebombing survivors feared fire itself. Atomic weapon survivors feared an invisible contamination that might still be affecting them, that might cause illness years later, that might have altered them at a fundamental level. This was existential dread, rather than specific phobia. By midsummer 1945, the psychological impact of sustained incendiary raids on Japanese civilian morale was becoming strategically significant. Reports from neutral observers indicated widespread war weariness, increased questioning of governmental propaganda, and declining confidence in ultimate victory. Refugees from burned cities spread defeatism. Industrial production dropped as workers evacuated urban areas. Transportation networks struggled to move people away from threatened cities while simultaneously trying to maintain military supply lines. American strategic planners debated whether continuing incendiary raids would force surrender without invasion, or whether escalation to atomic weapons was necessary. This debate happened in ignorance of the psychological distinctions we can now observe historically. Planners assumed that increased lethality would produce proportionally increased pressure for surrender. They didn't understand that the specific horror of fire had already created near-maximal psychological impact, and that atomic weapons, while more destructive per attack, might actually produce less incremental psychological pressure because their effects were too overwhelming to be processed emotionally. When the atomic strikes occurred in early August, immediate Japanese governmental response was more bureaucratic than panicked. Officials struggled to understand exactly what had happened. Initial reports from Hiroshima were confused and conflicting. The weapon's unprecedented nature made it difficult to assess. Was this a single bomb or many bombs? If one bomb, what kind? Could it be repeated? How many such weapons existed? The questions required investigation, not immediate emotional reaction. Meanwhile, memories of incendiary raids remained visceral and immediate for millions of civilians. They didn't need to understand the physics of atomic weapons to know they wanted the conflict to end. They had already experienced the worst they could personally imagine: hours of pursuing flame, impossible choices, family members lost to fire. The atomic weapons added scale, but not qualitatively new horror to what firebombing had already inflicted. Historians examining Japanese surrender in August 1945 often focus on the atomic weapons as the decisive factor. But declassified documents from Japanese government meetings in that period reveal a more complex calculation. The Soviet Union's entry into the conflict on August 8th, breaking neutrality and invading Manchuria, removed Japan's last hope for negotiated peace. The atomic weapons demonstrated American technological capability, but didn't fundamentally change strategic realities already evident from months of incendiary raids. Japan had lost air superiority, defensive capabilities were inadequate, civilian areas could be struck at will, and continuation meant only escalating suffering. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo's diary entries from August detail deliberations about surrender terms. He mentions atomic weapons in the context of providing a face-saving rationale for capitulation. The arrival of an unprecedented weapon gave the government excuse to reverse course without admitting earlier strategies had failed. But his private writing reveals greater concern about civilian morale, food shortages, and Soviet invasion than about atomic weapons specifically. The Incendiary campaign had already created the civilian pressure for peace. The atomic strikes provided diplomatic cover. Post-conflict interviews with Japanese military and civilian leaders consistently showed this pattern. The bombs were shocking, unprecedented, devastating, but asked whether they would have advocated different decisions if the atomic strikes had not occurred, most indicated that circumstances had already become untenable by early August. Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, serving as Prime Minister during the surrender, told American interviewers that his primary concern throughout summer was not any specific weapon, but the accumulating evidence that continued conflict would result in civilian starvation and complete urban destruction. Processes already well underway through sustained incendiary attacks. The psychological legacy of incendiary versus atomic weapons persisted through generations. Organizations supporting bombing survivors focused different resources on the two populations. Firebombing survivors needed treatment for persistent fire phobias, anxiety disorders, depression related to loss and guilt. Support groups emphasized sharing of survival narratives and processing of decision point trauma. Atomic weapon survivors, called hibakusha, needed medical monitoring for radiation effects, support in managing stigma related to contamination fears, and help processing survivor guilt and existential questions about why they lived when others did not. Kazuko participated in survivor testimony programs from the 1970s onward, speaking primarily to school groups about her experience in the Tokyo firebombing. Her presentations always included the same core message: humanity must never again create situations where civilians face hours of pursuing flame with no escape and no help. She rarely mentioned atomic weapons, except to note that while they were terrible in their instantaneous destruction, the prolonged terror of fire created a different order of suffering. When Kazuko passed away in 2008 at age 86, her obituary in the Asahi Shimbun newspaper mentioned that she had survived the March 10th firebombing. Hundreds of readers wrote comments, many sharing their own family stories of that night or other incendiary raids. The emotional intensity of these responses, 6 decades after the events, spoke to how deeply fire terror had embedded itself in collective memory. Nakamura took a different path, becoming a civil engineer who specialized in fire-resistant urban design. His career was devoted to ensuring that modern cities could not burn the way Tokyo had. He consulted on building codes across Asia, advocating for fire breaks, flame-resistant materials, emergency water systems, and evacuation planning that assumed worst-case scenarios. He told colleagues that his work was partly technical and partly exorcism, an attempt to build protections his 9-year-old self had desperately needed and not found. The historical record now clearly documents that incendiary raids on Japanese cities caused more total casualties than atomic weapons, displaced more civilians, destroyed more urban area, and created more sustained psychological trauma across the population. Yet international memory has focused on Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the signature horrors of strategic bombing. This reflects several factors: the atomic weapons' unprecedented technology, their revolutionary implications for future conflict, their symbolic power in Cold War politics, and the relative silence of firebombing survivors who received less international attention. But for those who lived through both types of attack, the hierarchy of horror remained clear. Fire pursued you. Fire gave you time to be afraid and made you watch your choices fail. Fire created personal narratives of decision and consequence that atomic weapons' instantaneous obliteration did not. The flash of atomic light was terrible but brief. The hours inside a firestorm were an extended confrontation with mortality that imprinted itself on consciousness in ways that instantaneous destruction, paradoxically, did not. The question of why Japanese civilians feared incendiary bombs more than atomic weapons ultimately reveals profound truths about human psychology. under extreme threat. We fear most not the largest destructive force, but the one that engages our consciousness across extended time, that creates moments of false hope followed by despair, that puts us in situations where our survival depends on decisions we are not equipped to make. We fear weapons that make us participants in our own potential destruction rather than passive recipients of overwhelming force. The incendiary campaigns against Japan represented a kind of strategic cruelty that modern military doctrine has largely abandoned, not because of insufficient effectiveness, but because of recognition that certain weapon employment methods cross ethical boundaries regardless of technical legality. The psychological impacts on both victims and those who survived created intergenerational trauma that arguably exceeded even the radiation legacy of atomic weapons. For Kazuko, who spent her final decades speaking to students about that March night in 1945, the lesson was simple but profound. The worst weapon is not the one that ends life most quickly, but the one that extends suffering most completely, while offering the illusion of possible escape. Atomic weapons were mercy compared to fire, because they did not hunt you through burning streets, did not force you to choose between family members, did not give you hours to understand what was happening while being unable to change it. She would end her presentations with a question for students. If you had to choose between instant obliteration and 3 hours of flame with uncertain escape, which would you choose? The question was designed not to have a right answer, but to make clear that both options represented human failure of such magnitude that preventing such choices from ever occurring again should be civilization's highest priority. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.